Hey, Adrian Peta from World Geopolitics channel. Here, and in today's video we're going to talk about something controversial. And what is this controversy? A report that came out from the Range Corporation talking about the relationship between the United States and China. And it was very controversial because it basically laid things out there. What plans should the United States make about China in the next few years? Also, what is the Range Corporation? The Range Corporation is an American think tank. But what is a think tank, and aren't they found outside the United States too? A think is a research agency that develops strategies and plans for governments. Each country has its own think tanks, and they conduct this research to try to help governments deal with certain threats that arise. It can be private or public. For Range Corporation, it's private. And it's made up of former CIA agents and people who are retired from the State Department and the Department of Defense. But not just former CIA agents and retired personnel, but even those who are still active, right? Still working there. So if you want to know what the next steps in American foreign policy will be, for example, you take a look at the Range Corporation, right? To find out what their plans are for the coming years. They may not follow it exactly, but it gives you a sense of their priorities and direction, which is interesting. But that report was very controversial, so much so that they took it down. Whoever downloaded it. Whoever didn't, missed out, right? And you can't see it anymore? But not really, because I was one of the few people, right? Because they took it down in just a few hours. Because they got a flood of criticism, right? Anyone who downloaded it got it, but I managed to download it, and I'll put the file of this report on the channel's GitHub. You knew the channel has a GitHub, right? If you want to see the exclusive maps I make here for the channel, that I make specifically to illustrate my ideas. Or even some tables and charts, take a look. It's open to the public, right? If you can use it in your academic research, in your thesis, in your class, the only thing I ask in return is that you give credit to the World Geopolitics channel. But I'm going to put that report there for everyone to see, because what if in the future they upload another version that's already censored or something like that, right? So just to be sure, I'm going to upload the full report there, alright? And we're going to look at it in detail because it's very important, since it basically shows what the next steps of American policy toward China will be. I'm Adrian Peta, and this is World Geopolitics. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, which is practically an obscure cult in the YouTube world, alright? As the dynamics in the Asia-Pacific region become more and more intense, the United States is calculating what to do about China. And by all indications, the leadership in Washington believes they have missed the window of opportunity to do something about the defense of Taiwan, without this escalating into a larger regional conflict, and most likely they believe they would be defeated in that context. Thus, the Range Corporation report, which is highly influential behind the scenes at the United States State Department, began to see this reality, and more than that, started planning what to do in a post-Taiwan situation. They argue that preventing a Chinese attack on Taiwan would be the main focus of United States and Allied security planning, so that they would combine a doctrinal review, long-term partnerships, and war games as economic instruments, more specifically aimed at sanctions. But they make it clear that the preventive use of these measures 3 to 6 months before a Chinese aggression, if considered imminent, would be very ineffective and inconvenient. The reports then investigate how sanctions and export controls could influence Beijing's decision, what countermeasures China would launch, and what the global macroeconomic effects would be. They conclude that Washington may in fact resort to preventive sanctions, but its success will depend on whether other allies would participate or not. And even then, that wouldn't rule out the chance of China taking action. Despite the size of its gross domestic product, it still has deep internal weaknesses, such as high debt, rapid aging, a shrinking workforce, dependence on exports, and vulnerability to external shocks. And these weaknesses make the country more exposed to sanction regimes. But the global record shows that although sanctions impose heavy economic costs on countries, they almost never achieve their strategic political objectives. This confirms a point that I've repeated here on the channel many times. Sanctions almost never work. The structural weakness of China does exist, but sanctions rarely change the decisions of weaker states. So what can we say about a much stronger China? It's highly unlikely that they will also change China's position in the Allied arrangement. The United States is an absolutely central player with legal means, financial weight, extremely high commercial reach, and is less dependent on foreign trade than its partners. The dollar, the import market, and regulatory capacity form the tripod of American coercive power. The report makes it clear that the priority for bringing to the American side would be Australia and Japan. Exactly like here on the channel. I've also mentioned back in 2024 that any United States military action to try to defend Taiwan would crucially depend on China's position. Japan, the American willingness to defend Taiwan is practically zero, and even if they took the risk, it would most likely be a defeat on a strategic level. Even so, the research and development report concludes that direct participation from these allies, Japan and Australia, is unlikely, because both Australia and Japan would tend to act in a more limited way, contributing either with intelligence or political coordination, or with specific measures. But more than that, real participation in a war would be unrealistic. As for Beijing's calculations, preventive sanctions could only have an effect under very specific conditions, if they were limited and punitive, and if the Chinese elite and public opinion are divided. If economic growth were still a strategic priority, and if the coalition of countries imposing the sanctions were broad and coherent, maybe that could discourage them, but it would depend on the Chinese themselves. In that case, China would retaliate in a symmetrical way, for example by restricting exports of intermediate goods, while at the same time trying to de-escalate without losing internal prestige. However, if the leadership had already politically decided on a large-scale military operation, the sanctions would have almost no effect. They wouldn't stop the invasion, they would only degrade its military campaign, but not enough to prevent it from happening. And it would still have a limited impact on the financial sector and its markets, with the Chinese government itself reducing the importance of economic growth in the hierarchy of national priorities. The United States has been preparing to make a future Chinese operation against Taiwan more challenging. Since the first Trump administration, and even more intensively under Biden, export controls and technological sanctions have tried to degrade China's military capabilities. In the long run, exports to China of advanced semiconductors, AI systems, and key components are restricted. They power signals intelligence, electronic warfare capability, the capability of their radars, their jamming capability, their automated logistics, accelerated decision-making, hypersonic weapon simulations, nuclear projects, and battlefield modeling. This is a preliminary campaign to try to structurally weaken the Chinese, but so far it hasn't produced results. This leads us to a question. If United States intelligence detected with high confidence an imminent Chinese invasion of Taiwan, as happened with Russia, what would happen? For Ukraine, there would be a package of preventive sanctions, just like what happened with the early information about the Russians in 2022, and the report states that yes, Washington would probably apply preventive sanctions, but without any guarantee of implementation, that is, of success. However, even if they were applied, their effectiveness would depend on the political context at the time it happens, and also on the degree of cohesion of the United States Allied coalition, something that historically is unstable. American allies hardly join in without direct pressure and assertive leadership from the United States. The central problem is clearly shown. Containing China has become a strategic priority for the United States and its allies, making sanctions an integral part of the deterrence package. But the experience in 2022 against Russia showed that sanctions did not prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. And although they caused some economic hardship, they failed to change the strategic decisions in the Kremlin, and crucially, they ended up damaging European economies much more than the Russian economy. And here is the decisive point, because applying this against China would be incomparably more difficult for three combined reasons: the size of China's economy, its deep entanglement with global supply chains, and the fact that Beijing is already actively preparing to face this sanctions scenario. The report is quite clear. Australia is highly dependent on China to maintain its economy, tends to politically support the United States, but would hesitate to join in heavy sanctions, except if the Australians realize that this could evolve into an existential threat, but a collapse of the Chinese economy would inevitably lead to the economic collapse of Australia. Would an Australian intervention be merely symbolic or focused only on intelligence? Japan, on the other hand, which has the technical and institutional capacity to quickly sanction the Chinese, would face a much more complicated dilemma. Millions of Japanese people and thousands of companies are deeply established in China, and on top of that, it would be very difficult to justify actions that would put Japanese citizens and their assets at direct risk of retaliation. The United Kingdom could join the United States-led bloc, but its position on Taiwan is ambiguous, because London would only act within a bloc of countries that supported this on a large scale. And even if they had the support of many countries, the estimated economic effects would be relatively modest for the Chinese. That's because the report projects only long-term impacts, with the capacity to reduce China's gross domestic product by just 1% per year in broader scenarios. With the full Western coalition, the damage could be up to 2.5% of annual gross domestic product. The United States gross domestic product would drop by 0.5%. In other words, they can even absorb it, and the drop could be even smaller if partners participate in a coordinated way. In short, even with a broad coalition, coercion, controls, and blockades cause only minor harm to the Chinese. From 1 to 2.5 and from 0.5 for the United States. To deter a military operation that Beijing had already decided to carry out, it's obvious that this would be insufficient. The real usefulness would not be in deterring the invasion, but in degrading China's ability to sustain prolonged operations. However, the Taiwan scenario does not allow for the continuous shipment of weapons there, as happened in Ukraine. Any sanctions regime or economic restrictions by the United States against China will necessarily be accompanied by Chinese countermeasures, that is, some form of Chinese retaliation. And these costs need to be factored into the American political calculation. This vulnerability comes in part from the fact that China is one of the world's main industrial suppliers, with Chinese components and products present even in supply chains, a dependency on American defense articles that the Department of Defense has already acknowledged, pointing out that even items manufactured within the United States often depend on precursors produced in China, creating points of failure in the chain. Within this context, semiconductors are a critical point. Taiwan dominates the production of advanced chips, and China is a relevant player in previous generation chips, which are still essential. If China retaliates by blocking the flow of semiconductors from Taiwan to the rest of the world, this could greatly delay American advances in artificial intelligence. With estimates that the United States could only maintain its current pace of development for 4 to 10 months before starting to feel the effects of the shortage. On the other hand, it's clear that China has its own vulnerabilities. The big mystery in this matter is assessing the effectiveness of the sanctions. In the Chinese logic, economic security is closely intertwined with security itself, and that's why the country has been gradually building for years what we might call a fortress economy, with an emphasis on food security, energy independence, and supply chain resilience. This orientation from Beijing was crystallized in the 14th Five-Year Plan of 2021, which explicitly incorporated self-sufficiency as a central axis of the country's economic security strategy. This building of resilience is not limited to the real and fundamental economy. It also applies to finance, as Chinese authorities recognize the dollar's global dominance is a vulnerability in any economic conflict with the United States. But they also know that they won't be able to replace it so quickly without deep reforms, such as an even deeper liberalization of their economy. Given this, the Chinese have chosen a strategy of partial internationalization of their currency, the yuan, and have amplified it. Commercial payments so that, if the United States imposes financial sanctions, China can still trade with most of its partners. In parallel to this, the Chinese have strengthened control over their domestic financial system, which, in general, has complied with American sanctions to avoid direct financial retaliation. and they have been diversifying and obscuring the composition of their foreign currency reserves precisely to reduce the risk of freezes or confiscation. In 2024, for the first time, 50% of China's cross-border transactions were settled in yuan. The currency's share in global payments nearly doubled from 2014 to 2025, but in relative terms, this jump is still considered modest, from 2 to just over 4% of the global total. Furthermore, a large part of this use of the yuan comes from flows between Hong Kong and the mainland, suggesting that the dollar is still the main payment currency for China's foreign trade. The report makes it clear that the United States can no longer prevent the loss of Taiwan, although it mentions that the United States should not accept this for free, if Taiwan is defined as an existential objective. For the Chinese Communist Party, no economic measure will change the outcome if the attack is a prior strategic decision by the Communist Party. The West doesn't have economic means capable of changing that, and most likely the United States will be almost alone in this critical phase, making the impact even more useless. Because, by all indications, China is preparing precisely to withstand the rupture scenario that a war over Taiwan could require. This means that Wrench and the United States State Department understand that sanctions are tools for managing a defeat, not a way to prevent a Chinese invasion. In other words, they are preparing readers for the reorganization of the system after the fall of Taiwan, not to prevent it. This leads us to the other, even more controversial report made by State Department and Defense Department advisors. And here it becomes clear that Washington's new strategy is about how to coexist with China after this scenario. This analysis argues that United States-China rivalry stems from conflicting interests, not misunderstandings. Deep political distrust and a mutual perception that the other side is trying to undermine its power. From the American perspective, the confrontation stems from China's authoritarian regime and its history of predatory, aggressive actions in various areas. Remember, this is the United States' point of view regarding China, because at the same time, they recognize that the need to stabilize this rivalry does not mean softening the competition or giving in on vital issues. China pursues goals that conflict with United States interests and seeks to lead in key science and technology sectors. The American task would then be twofold: to contain China's most dangerous ambitions and to protect its own interests, but avoiding the escalation of the clash into cycles of extreme tension. Not only this controversial report and the other one I mentioned, but practically all United States defense, geopolitics, and security reports make it very clear it's vital to rule out the risk of a war with China. From there, principles are then defined for an intense but manageable rivalry. Both sides would need to accept, deeply rooted among decision makers, that some form of living together is inevitable. In addition, some level of shared vision regarding the organizing principles of international politics would be necessary, defining a minimally shared status quo, and the establishment of mechanisms and institutions that function as buffers and pathways back to stability when there are crises and shocks. Based on these principles, the report recommends 6 broad initiatives to moderate this rivalry. First, clarify the objectives of the United States, using language that rejects absolute notions of total victory, and explicitly accept the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. This would reduce China's fear of regime change sponsored by Washington. Second, reopen and strengthen reliable lines of communication between high-level officials so that there is continuous space for strategic dialogue. Third, improve crisis management practices and architectures with protocols, channels, and agreements between the two countries that reduce the risk of accidental escalations. Fourth, seek specific agreements, both public and private, to limit and regulate cyber competition between the two countries. Fifth, mutually declare acceptance of the other side's strategic nuclear deterrence, renouncing technologies and doctrines that put the adversary's second nuclear strike capability at risk, that is, the risk of retaliation. The sixth is to find small areas of cooperation on topics of common or humanitarian interest, which serve as buffer zones for constructive interaction, within a relationship of competition between the two countries. Until we reach the most delicate point, which is the issue of Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the competition in science and technology. In all of them, the logic is to combine firmness with stabilization mechanisms and not provoke China under any circumstances in the case of Taiwan. And pay close attention. The theory of success for Washington consists of maximizing the incentives for Beijing to seek gradual and patient ways to annex Taiwan. Instead of resorting to force, which requires 5 fronts, maintain the perspective of war as something dangerous and uncertain for the Chinese, and avoid obvious provocations that force the Chinese to act aggressively, providing the maximum political assurances so that Beijing feels comfortable adopting a long-term annexation strategy, reducing the risks of unplanned military encounters, and creating political and military mechanisms for constant communication. In this sense, the report points out that it is essential for the United States to reiterate that they do not support or encourage Taiwan's independence, nor do they seek a permanent separation. And China, reaffirming its preference for a gradual reunification. Yes, the United States is saying that they accept the annexation of Taiwan by China as long as it happens gradually. In the South China Sea, this theory of success combines military deterrence with multilateral diplomacy. This means 4 main objectives: to prevent any regional actor from resorting to direct aggression to impose their claims, to discourage other claimants in the South China Sea from taking symbolic or isolated actions that provoke the Chinese to respond more harshly, to initiate new diplomatic processes, both multilateral and bilateral, that establish a path toward dispute resolution, and to create cooperative bodies to address common threats. Finally, to rally wider international support for the principle that using force to resolve territorial disputes is unacceptable. And finally, in the competition in science and technology, Washington's success theory will try to manage the most dangerous aspects of emerging technologies for mutual security and for the very stability of the rivalry, at the same time pulling back from the most extreme efforts to sabotage technological advancement. On the Chinese side, the suggested focus is to identify and reduce the most risky competitive uses of new technologies, combining deterrence and bilateral agreements, definitely setting mutual boundaries. Actions aimed at hindering the rivals' scientific progress and finding limited areas of non-threatening collaboration, including to address global risks. The report then concludes that the rivalry between the United States and China is permanent and unsolvable in the short term, but it can be stabilized. The recommended strategy is twofold: maintain the level of competition, but build mechanisms that prevent the competition from escalating into military conflict. Authorized, cost or unnecessary provocation. China. The perception is that the United States cannot win by trying to crush China, and neither could China win by crushing the United States. Americans realize that the cost of trying to break China is prohibitive and could lead to a war, that they are not sure they would win, and are increasingly certain that they would be defeated. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the video where I crossed. So, the data from both reports, even the censored ones, will help us understand what it is. The United States plans to deal with China in the coming years, but things don't look good for the United States. Also, there's no reason for people to bother me, claiming I support China. Guys, I deal with reports, I deal with documents, I deal with numbers. My opinion comes after analyzing these numbers, and unfortunately, there's not much that can be done. And you can't say that the Han Corporation is a pro-China agency. On the contrary, they are viscerally anti-China, anti-American, and anti-Russian. So there's nothing else to say. For now, the situation is proving to be very complicated for the United States. But I'll also warn you that the United States is not a nation to be underestimated. They still have some capability. So let's keep going, because this saga between the United States and China is just getting started. It will likely last at least another 25 years until around 2050. We're going to talk a lot about this, assuming I'm still here. Who knows what could happen tomorrow? Anyway, to make sure I'm here, don't forget to subscribe. And more importantly, share this video with everyone to give some support here, to make sure this channel, so obscure and forgotten by YouTube, keeps existing. Your help is very important. And if you really like the channel, consider becoming a member. By becoming a member, you'll get early access to videos and access to exclusive videos from extremely technical series. For those who like things like History Channel documentaries, back when they used to make good documentaries, even today, we still follow that faithfully. And you help ensure that the channel keeps existing, since 90% of its revenue comes from members. If you can't join, just share, it helps a lot. That's it, folks. Thank you, hugs, and see you in the next video.